bless the Lord at all times, and his praises, come on, shall continually be in my mouth. My soul will make a boastful noise unto the Lord. Yeah, you would be shouting and clapping your hands if you left Nashville like I did and the storm passed over. You still got your activities. American Baptist College is still standing. My car didn't get flipped over and over. God spared my life. So I got to tell the Lord, thank you. I got to tell him, thank you. I got to tell him, thank him, because he's been just that good. Listen, I've been called to do a task. I've been called to do a task. Listen, would you stand with me for Mark chapter 4, 38, and we're going to read down to the 40th verse. Again, that is Mark chapter 4, starting at verse 38, and we're going to go down to the 40th verse. And thank you, Sister Shannon, for that beautiful introduction. Come on, let's give her a hand. We thank God for her. And when you're there, show by saying amen. And it reads, but he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Verse 39 says, he woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. You may be seated. Let us pray. Most gracious, kind God, thank you for this once again time together. God, I pray now that you would let the words of my mouth, the meditations of my heart, be acceptable in your sight. God, open our ears so that we may hear you. God, open our hearts so that we may receive your eternal love. God, open our minds so that we may be able to process the word that you have for us. But then, God, open our mouths so that we may be a witness to what you are doing, what you have done, and what you are getting ready to do. It is in Jesus' name we pray, and all of God's people said together, amen. People of God, if we poll the room this morning, we all would agree that the human body requires a certain amount of sleep in order to properly function. From the early ages of life, we are informed that the average person needs at least 8 hours or more of sleep. If you are an infant or a toddler, you need 9 to 10 hours plus 3 more or 4 more naps. But no one seems to ask the question, what happens when you go to sleep? Jody Tilley, in her article, Uncle Keith, What Happens to Your Body When You Sleep, suggests that in the first stages of sleep, you are just drifting off. You're in that first stage of sleep. Your eyelids are heavy. Your head starts dropping. Your mouth starts drooling. And you start snoring. And everybody's looking at you talking about you making too much noise to be asleep. But you are easily awoken in that first stage of sleep, and your brain is still relatively active. And by the 4th stage of sleep, you are in the deepest stage of sleep. And during that time, your muscles begin to relax. Your mind begins to ease. Your breathing becomes slow and rhythmic, which can lead to snoring, or in other words, calling the hogs home. I'm from North Carolina. And you feel like you become extremely hard to wake. What do you mean, Dave? Have you ever met somebody that gets that good narcolepsy or that itis after they've had that fried chicken, that okra, those collard greens? Y'all know what I'm talking about, that itis, and they get in that back room and then they get very sleepy and extremely hard to wake. After reading further into this informative article, she goes on to suggest that everyone needs sleep. First Lady, I instantly begin to wrestle with the philosophical and theological question of what happens when Jesus or God goes to sleep. Because if Jesus represents God in flesh, then that would mean God sleeps. But grandma's theology and apologetics suggest to us that God never sleeps nor slumber. Because if God slept, that means there would be nobody to maintain balance in the universe, which includes the electromagnetic radiation and matter that makes up what we call the galaxies and the stars. So therefore, planets, moons, stars, and the unknown contents of the intergalactic space, what they call it, and NASA would go unattended. To make it plain on this morning, that means if God sleeps, there is nobody to maintain the totality of existence. That means there's nobody to create balance in the world. So it becomes imperative that we ask ourselves, what happens when Jesus sleeps? If I could, for a few moments of your time, I want to talk from the sermonic subject, what happens when Jesus sleeps? Turn to your neighbor, say, neighbor, the preacher's going to preach about what happens when Jesus sleeps. Beloved, in our text this morning, we discover Jesus and his devoted disciples in a pitiless storm. They are on this boat in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, surrounded by steep cliffs and surrounded by treeless mountains. They are preparing to journey across to Galilee, and all of a sudden, there rises a rise in sea level. Some intense winds begin to force water into the shore, which causes this small fishing boat to rock and rail. And all of the beloved disciples are naturally in a terrible panic, and including the fishermen Andrew, Peter, James, and John, and the sons of Zebedee. And what becomes disturbing is Jesus is taking shelter under the stern deck while they are out on the ocean in this storm. And the text merely says that he is sleeping. Presumably, Jesus' beloved disciples, including the 4 who are fishermen, are in a terrible panic because although some of them have withered furious storm on the sea and are familiar with being on a boat in the middle of the storm, they undoubtedly have known fishermen who have lost their lives at being in this kind of storm. And although they are capable, self-reliant men who could handle the moderate danger of being in a storm, they realized that the danger of this storm is not moderate, but it is deadly. So as Mark begins to set up the storyline, there has been naturally in much speculation and talk regarding the fact that a violent storm is going on in the ocean, and it threatens to ruthlessly destroy the boat that Jesus and his inhabitants is on. And Jesus somehow manages to remain asleep on a cushion at the bottom of the boat in the middle of this vicious storm, because it seems as though everything undoubtedly has become chaotic and crazy when Jesus arbitrarily decides to go to sleep in the middle of a storm. How in the world can the man who've made lame people to walk, dumb folk to talk, open blinded eyes to see, find himself asleep in a storm at the bottom of the boat? What happens when Jesus sleeps? See, when Jesus goes to sleep, it seems as though everything gets out of hand. Things become crazy and disorderly. That's why some of us speculate our lives are in the condition that it is in, because we have allowed Jesus to go to sleep. And it appears that when we find ourselves in the storm, things in our lives that compel us to feel like the boat and its inhabitants, begin to feel like Aaliyah, because the storm of life is rocking the boat so much that it makes you not want to even be on the boat. It is in these moments when you feel like nothing in your life could possibly go right. Have you been there? You know those moments. If it's not one thing, then it is another. Or in those unfortunate situations when you feel like Lil Boosie and you got to smile to keep from crying. Y'all know what I'm talking about. I got some millennials in here. You got to smile to keep from opening up I'm in church. You got to smile to keep from cussing this person person out, cussing that person out, because they just don't know the storm that you are in. They just can't understand the things that you are going through, and you in the middle of the storm trying to maintain your mind, trying to maintain your soul, and trying to deal with this and that, and it seems as though while you're in your storm, Jesus is sleeping. You recollect those emotional times that you quote to yourself the words of Kendrick Lamar, "We gonna be all right," but the raging waves from your brutal storms are so chaotic that you feel like retracting your statement of declaration, and you begin to deliberately say to yourself, "No, I'm not all right. No, this isn't all right. I'm really about to lose my mind." Beloved, if you look at our world today, it exhibits the characteristics of multiple storms. There's a storm of the destruction of nature. Some folks call it climate change that Trump doesn't believe in, global warming that our dear president doesn't believe in, environmental disasters. And there is a storm of wars, large-scale conflicts between world leaders and countries. There is a storm of income, lack of employment opportunities, low and unfair wages, and those that are impoverished have lack of voice and insufficient capacity or opportunity to better one's life. In other words, they can't find no jobs. They say they keep creating jobs, but ain't no job for me. There is an unconstitutional storm of discrimination and inequality, income inequality, gender inequality, racial inequality, sexual orientation inequality. It's inequality when you go there. It's inequality when you go here. It seems as though you are in a storm. There is a storm of poverty, hunger, food deserts, folks without homes, living out in the street, and the economy is dropping. It's up and down. There's even a storm of crime when you can go to a brewery and open up fire on people. There is a storm of terrorism, trafficking of young girls, trafficking of children, drugs, police brutality, and no place seems to be safe, not even your job or the church house. There is a storm of religious conflict, deacon versus pastor, member versus member, church versus church, denomination versus denomination, world religion versus world religion. There's even a storm of corruption, lack of government accountability and transparency, poor infrastructure, roads, hospitals, school, housings, etc., inadequate sanitation. We got the coronavirus going on, poor education, lack of drinking water, power shortages. There is a storm, and as a result of this storm, you end up in a storm of leadership. And as a result of the storm of leadership, you end up with an incompetent, arrogant, egotistical, ignorant, narcissistic, and racist bully they despairingly refer to as the president of the free world. There is a storm. Can't you see that there's a storm out on the ocean? And I just came by Milwaukee to say that it's moving this way. And if we're not helpful, and if we're not, don't get out and vote, 2020 will cause us to be in the same storm that we're currently in. Things just might get worse than they are now. I can't tell you who to vote for. You pray, you talk to the God of your understanding. But all I'm saying is that you get out and vote, because I'm tired of being in a storm of leadership. I'm tired of tuition going up and down. They're arguing about this and that. I don't know if there is a storm. But when Jesus sleeps, not only is there a storm, there is a panic. And while you're in this storm, you begin feeling like the disciples, because you begin realizing that the intense storms of life are too tremendous to deal with. Therefore, you find yourself bitterly feeling like Chance the Rapper, because it seems as though paranoia is on your mind and got your mind on the fritz. And as the storms of life produce blustery winds of anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem that pushes the waters into the shores of your mind, which can lead to the flooding of of your mental stability, you find out that you just can't handle it. You then discover yourself in a panic. You then discover yourself trying to find resources to get yourself out of the storm. You can't call FEMA because this is not natural, but rather it's spiritual, and you're trying to find somebody to turn to help you and aid you while you're in the storm. See, the reason why you're panicking is not because you've never been in a storm, but you're panicking because as the storm begins to progress, it starts to become too much. And this, it results in, once again, you feeling like LMA, so deep in your feelings, not because you're booed up, but because it seems as though Jesus starts developing a precarious condition of extreme sleepiness. In other words, Jesus commences developing a case of sleep deprivation in the middle of your storm. And when you've realized that Jesus may or may not be sleeping your storm, it makes you question, does Jesus care about the storm? And you find yourself indignantly, like the disciples, asking, carest not that we perish? Because it seems as though Jesus doesn't recognize the raging storm, seeing as when you inadvertently get in a storm like this, it seems as though Jesus is not moving at the speed that you want him to move. We all have been in situations where we've prayed, we've fasted, we've cried, we've sung on the choir, we've came to Bible study, we've tithed, and it seems as though nothing has been enough to aid you in your storm. It seems as though I'm doing my part, but Jesus, where are you? Can you wake up? Can you move? Can you do something? I need something to help me get out of my storm. See, when you look at the text, the disciples get a sense of inclusivity. It wasn't exclusive, because you notice they say we in the storm. It ain't just us in the storm. We in the storm. And then it reminds me, y'all know I might be dating myself, but it reminds me of High School Musical, for those y'all are millennials. And they got around and they said, we're all in this together. That's what the disciples are saying to Jesus. We're all in this together. In other words, they're saying to Jesus, we are in this storm together and it's not looking good. We're imploring you to wake up and do something, because we're sinking and we're perishing. I've been there where I'm sinking and I'm perishing, because I've understood that even though Jesus doesn't wake up, I have to have enough faith to trust that he'll show up in the storm. See, when you are disproportionately in a terrible panic, your humble request instantly becomes a frantic demand. I'm beyond saying, please God, but now I have moved to saying, God, I need you to do something right now. I need you to move expeditiously, just like when you did in Genesis and spoke and said, let there be. I need you to speak in my life and say, let this stop. You got, when your frantic demand is no longer a humble request. And see, what you have to understand is that the disciples, although some of them are experienced, naturally the disciples were afraid. And granted, they have undergone enough at sea. But in spite of that, they were experienced enough to know that they could not calm the storm. But they were also experienced enough to plead for help. In other words, you may not be able to calm the storm in your life, or may be able to tell the wind to blow at your command, or the waves to stop raging in your life. You may not even be able to tell the sea when to stop or the storm to cease. But there is one constellation that you ought to be happy to know, is that you have a Jesus that can. In other words, like the disciples, you have enough sense to know that I may not be able to do it alone, but I have a Jesus that can. See, therefore, therefore, what you uncover right away is that the disciples are no longer worried about getting off the boat. Their critical concern becomes trying to figure out how to wake up a sleepy and drained Jesus. We all have tried to wake Jesus up in our lives. But the thing about it is, the question and the dilemma becomes from the disciples is, how in the world do I wake up a sleepy Jesus? How do I wake up the one that never sleeps nor slumber? Is he actively sleeping, or is he just sleep? Y'all know sleep. And so this humorously suggests that when all of this is going on, Jesus was sleeping. But then I asked myself, I said, Chandler, why is this funny? The reason why it's funny is because the wind didn't wake Jesus. The arguing of the disciples did not wake Jesus. And the water splashing over the boat did not wake Jesus. But at the cry of his disciples, he immediately woke. And Jesus became like an attentive mother who sleeps soundly through all the night. But at the slightest cry of her baby boy or her baby girl, she instantly wakes. Which now makes you raise the question, what happens when Jesus wakes up? And when Jesus woke up, the Message Bible says he told the wind to pipe down and said to the sea, quiet and settle down. The wind ran out of breath. The sea became smooth as glass. For you King James readers, he rebukes the storm and simply says to the storm, peace, be still. And what happens when Jesus wakes up is that the storm is calm, because if you carefully examine the text, when Jesus spoke to the storm, he speaks in the same manner he used to rebuke demons and silence demons. Can I put some Chandler in this? Jesus puts his theophanic abilities on display by performing an exorcism on nature. In other words, he casted the demon out of the sea and told the demon, peace, be still. And sometimes you got to learn how to call Jesus in your life and wake Jesus up and tell your storm, peace, be still. You can't say it in a humble and facet way, but rather you ought to pull up your bootstraps and stick out your chest and look at the thing that you're going through and put some bass in your voice like my grandma told me and say, peace, be still. You got to learn how to wake up Jesus. Therefore, it proposes that Jesus did not look at the storm as a weather crisis, but he looked at it as an act of spiritual warfare. Jesus' words, peace be still, has a God-like quality to them, because in the Hebrew scripture, in other words, the Old Testament, it portrays God as exercising power over the waters and the earth. In other words, Jesus could have stopped the storm at any time because he had the ability to do it. So when Jesus calms the storm in your life, you become like the disciples, and in a matter of seconds, you get a front row seat to the view, the humanity of Jesus and the fullness of his divinity. In other words, you get an opportunity to see Jesus for who Jesus really is. This suggests that when Jesus wakes up and the storm is calm, but not only this, the panic is calm. And what happens when the panic is calm, what shouted me about the text, Uncle Kiva, is that Mark informs us about the other little boats surrounding Jesus' boat, and that when Jesus calmed the Sea of Galilee, he did not only rescue himself and the disciples, but for all of the other folks that was around him. This means that when Jesus wakes up in your life, he doesn't just rescue you from the storm, but he rescues everyone around you. In other words, when Jesus blesses me in my life, he doesn't just bless me in my household, but he stops by my neighbor's house. When Jesus calms my problems, that means that he calms yours too. As I prepare to take my seat, I'm reminded of the time, Uncle Keith, I had an internship in San Antonio, Texas, the middle of the desert, hot. I don't ever want to go to hell. That's why I live right. But I got on my plane, and as we became airborne, the jetliner that was taking us to Charlotte, it began experiencing turbulence, First Lady. And the plane began going up and down. It began shaking and gyrating and losing altitude. And I was annoyed. I was aggravated because I was scared. I don't do I don't get on roller coasters or nothing like that. But the more turbulence we experienced, the more afraid I became. And once I got my business straight with the Lord, because I didn't know how I was going in, I just had to get my business straight. If I realized that everyone around me was hollering and screaming except the little girl who was sitting across from me directly behind the cockpit. And when everything returned to normal, I leaned over to the little girl with my preachery self and I said, "Hey neighbor, I'm amazed by your calmness." Everybody else on the plane was screaming and hollering. Everybody else on the plane was troubled. Everybody else on the plane was calling for the attendant. Everybody else on the plane was trying to figure out what was going on. But you sat there as though everything was all right. And I said, "Hey neighbor, why are you so calm?" The little girl replied, "I wasn't afraid because my daddy is flying the plane. And he promised me that we would make it home safely. And this simply means for us that no matter how bad things get in our life, everything will be all right." My grandma used to sing a song, "I got a feeling that everything will be all right." My grandma said, "God done told me that everything will be all right." The songwriter said, "Though the storms keep on raging in my life, and sometimes it gets hard to tell the night from day, but still there's hope that lies within me, and I'm reassured, and that's because my soul has been anchored in the Lord." And you want to tell somebody that my soul has been anchored. I don't care what the doctors say. My soul has been anchored. I don't care how high my school bill gets. My soul has been anchored. I don't care what they take from me. My soul has been anchored. Is there anybody here that can shake their neighbor's hand and say, "Hey neighbor, I can be calm in the storm because everything is gonna be all right." And the reason why I can say everything is gonna be all right is because one Friday they marched him up a hill called Golgotha. They put nails in his feet. They put nails in his hands. A crown of 72 thorns on his head. And he put his head in the locks of his shoulders. And he died until the sun threw a fit and refused to shine. He died until the ground began to shake like an old drunken man. He died until the earth began to shake some more, and it began to shake just like that boat. It began to shake just like that tornado in Nashville. But one thing I know is that everything is going to be all right. And the reason why I can say everything is going to be all right is because one Sunday morning he got up with all power in his hands, storm fixing power, bill paying power, mind regulation power. Is there anybody here that can say, "I'm so glad that Jesus got up in my storm"? God bless you.